are few things as satisfying as making something with your own two hands from materials that you've harvested and processed directly from nature. Well, that's exactly what I'll be sharing with you in this video as I'm building a river table style kitchen island from some black walnut and cedar that I harvested with my Granberg Alaskan chainsaw mill. The first thing I had to do was head out to the woods of southern Missouri to harvest some beautiful red cedar and black walnut, which are the two primary woods that I built the island out of. After cutting some nice slabs with my Granberg chainsaw mill, I had to dry and season the wood for almost a year before I could start working with it. However, as I'll share in a future video, there are ways to greatly accelerate the drying process. After the wood was ready to work with, I had to level out my boards as they tend to get a little bit warped while they're drying, so for this initial step, I used my router sled to get all my lumber nice and flat and level, which I then smoothed out a little more with my power planer. I made the tabletop out of 3 planks of wood, which I then glued together in 2 different sections to get a good, level, tight bond. As you can see here, I place heavy weights on the wood while it's being glued to eliminate any bowing or warping caused by the pressure from the wood clamps. Here I am measuring and cutting out the leg sections, which I then work over with my power planer as well to get nice and flat. So after the tabletop is all glued together, I cut out some trim pieces to go around the edge of the table, which I fashioned in place with some light nails and then glued it all together. Next, I planed the whole top section down and gave it a good sanding, working my way down from a 36 grit sandpaper to a 120 grit. With the main tabletop almost done, I started working on the base of the tabletop, which I made out of this beautiful red cedar. So here I am cutting all the pieces that I need from some big slabs. Before attaching the tabletop base, I wanted to seal the underside of the black walnut top, which I did with a fairly heavy coat of good old shellac. Here's a close-up of both the black walnut and the cedar, which you can see here is just really cool-looking, beautiful wood. The next step is to put the tabletop base together and attach it, which I did with my pocket hole jig and screws, as well as some wood glue. Well, now it's back to working on the stand part of the island, so here I am finishing up the legs. I gave them a good sanding and also put a cool looking edge on the legs with my router. Next, I'm drilling the holes, getting everything leveled up, and attaching the legs. this island a rustic, old-world look, I'm using a bunch of cast iron shelf supports, which I got from Hobby Lobby at a very reasonable price. Now the wood for the shelves is nothing fancy, just some old boards that I slapped together, as they're going to be eventually painted black. So here I am putting the shelves and supports together and giving the whole thing another sanding. Next comes the really fun part. I was originally just going to have the top of the island be plain black walnut, but after visiting a live edge woodworking shop recently and seeing all the cool river tables that they had on display, I decided to do something similar. So while brainstorming some designs with my wife, she had the genius idea of basing the river design on real rivers. So first I got on Google Earth and got some satellite images of two of my favorite spots on two of my favorite rivers. The American River on Kodiak Island, Alaska, and the Merrimack River in southern Missouri. Next, as you can see here, I printed out the images, I cut them out, and then I traced them on the tabletop, which I then routed out just a little bit so I could come back and do a colored epoxy inlay. Before I did the epoxy resin finish on the table, I completed the rest of the island, the tabletop base, and the stand by applying many coats of polyurethane as I'm doing here. So here I am painting the shelves as well as the shiny wood screws with some satin finish black paint to give the whole thing more of a rustic look. And now it's time for the first coat of epoxy resin, which is a very thin seal coat which greatly helps eliminate any bubbles when you put on the final heavy-duty flood coat. Now, if you've never worked with epoxy resin before, it's extremely important that you read the directions thoroughly in regard to the mixing procedures, as it's absolutely essential that you do it right. So after getting my epoxy properly mixed and prepared, I applied a very light, thin coat over the entire surface, and then went over the whole thing with my propane torch to pop any bubbles that formed, which lots of them do as the epoxy soaks into the bare wood. So after that first light seal coat is dry, which is a good 24 hours later, I mixed up another small batch of epoxy with some blue dye that I'm using for the river section of the design. And after all that's dry, I take the tabletop outside and lightly sand the whole thing down to get out any bubbles that formed and to prepare the surface for the next step, which is adding another layer of slightly darker blue epoxy. Now, by the way, epoxy dust is very hazardous to your health and terrible for your power tools. So be sure to use the proper safety equipment, and as I like to do, vacuum it up as fast as you can and also clean your tools immediately. After sanding down the top lightly, I gave it a good cleaning with the shop vac once again, as well as wiped down the whole surface with some rubbing alcohol. Another important step is to tape up any areas underneath where epoxy might be seeping through. All it takes is one tiny crack or seam for the epoxy to leak through while you're applying it, which can really screw up your project and waste lots of material. As always, before you apply epoxy, make sure your tabletop is good and level, which I'm doing here before applying the next layer of slightly darker blue epoxy, which makes the river part of the design look more like an actual river. So after doing another round of bubble popping while the epoxy is drying, which you have to do sometimes for up to an hour, I then lightly sanded the whole thing down once again in preparation for the final flood coat of epoxy resin. For the final flood coat, I mixed up a large batch of epoxy, poured it right in the middle, and slowly spread it out over the edges, which I then brushed in around the edges with a paintbrush. And by the way, I highly recommend getting mixing tools, brushes, and containers from your local dollar store, as whatever you use to work with and apply epoxy resin will be totally shot afterwards. After that final heavy-duty flood coat, I let the whole thing dry for several days before doing the final touch-up work. And the first thing I do, as far as touch-up work, is to get rid of the epoxy drips from underneath the edge of the table that form while the flood coat is spreading out and drying. To do that, I first use my Dremel tool cutoff wheel, and then go back and very carefully sand it down. And as you can see here, I'm using a piece of cardboard to protect the finished wood. After that, I then mask off the main tabletop trim area and give the area where I cut the drips off, as well as the cedar base, one final coat of polyurethane to blend everything in nicely. Now the bolts that I'm using for attaching the top section to the stand are nice and new and shiny, right from the hardware store, which really isn't the look that I was going for. So to give them more of a dull, rustic color and finish, you can heat them up with a torch for a few minutes and quench them in water, which really knocks down the shine and gives them a flat, dull metal finish. So here's a look at the final product, all put together and ready for action. Now I didn't have the best lighting here for our photo shoot, but hopefully you can still get a good idea of how it turned out. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to see more like it, be sure to subscribe to this channel.